Thank you so much, everyone. I mean, it's an honor to present my paper when Ananya ma'am is chairing the session. Uh, like Ananya ma'am is my mentor, and thank you all for coming, for listening to the presentations. So, Anekantavada and Syadvada as philosophical tools to minimize cognitive biases is the theme of my research paper. And so, without wasting any more time, let me proceed to my presentation. So, yeah, my paper. Let me clear the aim of my paper. So, in recent times, as it has also been discussed yesterday, in recent times, philosophical counseling has emerged as a productive method to resolve issues concerning one's well-being by doing midwifery, as Dr. Pilgrims mentioned yesterday, to the thoughts and consequently spurring realization to alleviate issues. So, one of the most fundamental barriers to philosophical soundness is the cognitive biases an individual might carry. In the modern world, yeah, we are all in the world of social networks. So, without internet, our life is kind of incomplete. I can say that. So, the social networks that connect the world are fostering, unfortunately, hyper-partisan perspectives, maneuvering the congeniality biases of people, and causing blocks in their individual well-being. So, such biases also form the base of many daily life problems of human beings concerning decision making and judging. So, the paper aims to discuss about handling cognitive biases, which can impact the process of judgments and decision making, and majorly focuses on two important aspects. One is understanding the possibilities of the existence of multiple dimensions of reality through Anekantavada. As if you have heard Dr. Rick Ripati's talk yesterday, even he refers to Anekantavada and says in philosophical counseling it really plays an important role, even if they are not aware of this Jaina doctrine. And also to learn how one relies on heuristics and bounded rationality otherwise. And two is minimizing the specific cognitive biases with Syadvada using the Synd-narrative method, about which I'll be elaborating in the further slides. The paper's objective is to contribute to the discourse of philosophical counseling by putting forward Jaina doctrines Anekantavada and Syadvada as methodological tools to yield productive outcomes in attenuating cognitive biases. So let me explain in brief what cognitive biases are. So cognitive biases are basically, there are two types of biases. One is explicit and conscious biases. Second are unconscious and cognitive biases. So cognitive biases are subconscious errors in thinking that lead to misrepresentation or misinterpretation of information from the world around human beings, which affect their rationality and accuracy of decisions and judgments. So one thing is, we live in an immensely complex world, and when we try to interpret it, it's like we try to simplify the information which we get from outside, and in this process we use heuristics and kind of our I mean, in this effort we refer to biases. That's where biases come into the role. I mean, they come onto the stage. So unlike explicit biases, subjects are unaware of the unconscious of the cognitive biases they might carry. So now let me explain the relationship between bounded rationality and cognitive biases. They're kind of interdependent. So Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman were the first to give the term cognitive biases in their during the research program, heuristics and biases program. So it was based on this principle of bounded rationality. It's about perpetually flawed systematic patterns of responses to judgment and decision making problems. So Herbert Simon, in opposition to classical rationality, gives this concept called bounded rationality. He calls it bounded rationality. So classical rationality is mostly concerned with formalization of normative solutions to judgment and decision-making problems via statistics and probability approach, with the notion of bounded rationality, which address the specific constraints encountered by agents in their environments. So according to bounded rationality, and I somehow think this is also true. I mean, one of the reasons for our rationality being bounded, because humans have limited time, resources, cognitive capacity to make decisions ranging from choosing friends to food, classes to shoes, and hence may have to rely on heuristics or simple strategies to make decisions. So in this process, there are temporal and I mean, because of our temporal and cognitive constraints, we, I mean, don't see the other dimensions of whatever we want to explore. So we don't have all the essential knowledge as I already mentioned, we have limited time, resources, and cognitive capacity. So that's the reason we go for satisfactory decisions rather than optimal ones. When That's when we use heuristics, and these are the results. So this process of simplifying the immensely complex world and making decisions using heuristics makes cognitive biases a product of bounded rationality, which is called durniti. In Jainism, it's called durniti. So durniti is nothing but mistaking the partial truth to be whole and absolute truth. So that's when it's basically a kind of a bad judgment. So that's what happens. So when our rationality is bounded, cognitive biases come into the role. So that's one of the root causes. So now let me explain in brief what Anekantavada is all about. Before getting into the method part, I'll just explain Anekantavada and Syadvada. So Anekantavada in Jainism, Jainism believes in relativistic plurality. So like its metaphysics is characteristic. It's that way. So uh, Anekantavada is the doctrine of manyness of reality. So the realities of matter, Pudgala, and spirit or Jiva are considered different and distant. So there are an infinite number of material atoms and individual souls, each of which is real in its own right. So each atom and soul has a plethora of unique characteristics. An object has endless number of unique properties. So everything has an infinite number of positive and negative attributes. But it is possible. In terms of like things, absolute. What happens is it is possible for how do I say? To know only some qualities of a thing, but we cannot know all the qualities. So what happens is to know all the aspects of a thing, we'll have to be omniscient, which obviously we human beings are not. So the doctrine of Anekantavada can be implemented to make the subject realize that their rationality is bounded in terms of looking at only one perspective. We cannot look at all the perspectives, but we can change our viewpoint, looking at other possible ways of looking at a thing. So we can just change our viewpoint. That's what can be conveyed. So in conditions where the metaphysical nature of things could be multifaceted, uh, it's infinitely multifaceted. The subject could be made to understand the relativity involved in knowing things, because relatively there are many possibilities. So now let me in brief explain what Syadvada is. So Syadvada is the Jaina epistemological doctrine. It is the theory of relativity of knowledge. So Syat, which is perhaps relatively or possibly relatively speaking, is might be the most apt translation to English. Is viewed from a particular point that is necessarily related to other viewpoints and must precede all judgments. So, in light of Syadvada, both affirmation and negation, both absolute affirmation and negation are wrong. And this is actually not self-contradictory in nature, because when the very nature of reality is infinitely complex and intermediate, so a situation where both absolute affirmation and negation is not self-contradictory in nature, because again, our judgments are they're premised on specific viewpoints. So that's why all the judgments we make are double-edged. So for example, we see a tree and it's cut from one side, it's partially cut, and it's not cut from the other side. So I see it from the cut side and I say the tree is cut a bit. Yeah, it's a bit damaged. The one, if a person sees it from the other side, he'd say, no, it's not damaged. So relatively speaking, we both are right. Though we are looking at the same thing, it's from our own specific viewpoints, and the aspect we are looking, the aspect of the object we are exactly looking at. And we often dispute and often disagree in life because we forget this constraint and assume that our judgments are unconditionally true. So in Jainism, there are three ways of knowing: Durniti, Naya, and Pramana. Mistaking the partial truth to be the whole and absolute truth is called Durniti or bad judgment, as I already said. So for instance, if you claim that something is absolutely real or Sadeva, that is an absolute statement. You are claiming it to be absolutely true. So that's when it is called as Durniti. And the doctrine of Naya is a very prominent part of Jaina logic. So Nayas provide knowledge of a thing from specific perspectives, and these perspectives are abstractions through which reality is viewed. For example, a statement that a thing is real. So this is not an absolute statement. A thing could be real. So you can say that a pen is real, but then you're not claiming it absolutely. Then comes pramana or valid judgment, syat sat. So it is a statement of partial truth, knowing that it is partial, relative, and conditional, and has the possibility of being interpreted from different points of view. So for every naya, in order to become a pramana, it has to qualify syat. It must qualify syat. So to reject syat, which is relatively, perhaps, or possibly, shall mean to embrace absolutism, which is unwarranted, and further gets contradicted by experience. So moving further to the method. So the method which I would like to propose for the application of Anekantavada and Syadvada is narrative therapy. Narrative therapy is one of the important methods in philosophical counseling. It seeks to distance the person from the situation, allowing them to externalize rather than internalize their issues. So, narrative therapy is based on an individual's experience of reality and is principled that reality is not objective in nature. So, that's what even Anekantavada talks about, the manyness of reality, the multifacetedness, as it is not objective in nature. So, that is where Anekantavada meshes well with the narrative therapy method. So, the subject is to be made to understand that reality is multifaceted. The old story of the elephant and six visually impaired men, which the Jaina philosophers would like to quote whenever they explain Anekantavada, can be utilized for the same. So it's like there are six visually impaired men. They don't know how an elephant looks like, so they're left on an elephant, so that they can just touch and explore. So one of them holds the trunk and says, "Okay, elephant looks like a python." One of them holds its tail and says, "Elephant looks like a rope." One of them senses its leg and says, "An elephant is nothing but it's in the shape of a pillar." One holds its body and says, "It's like a wall." One holds its ear and says it's like a traditional fan. So they're all relatively what they are saying is right, actually, but in their particular viewpoint, you cannot deny that what they are saying is right. But then they don't have the complete knowledge of what an elephant looks like. For someone who sees an elephant from a distance, they can sense how an elephant looks like. So this is just a small example of how reality can be multifaceted. So further, after explaining how reality is multifaceted, we can ask the subject to develop a narrative. And on the basis of the narrative the subject develops, the cognitive biases they might have can be identified. And further, a Syad narrative, about which I'll be elaborating on the further slides, can be developed. So the Syad narrative is nothing but a narrative with the inclusion of Syat for all the absolute statements and judgments one would make in the narrative. So it can be constructed to explain the epistemological relativity involved in knowing and perceiving things. So the Syad narrative can be a useful tool to bring the subjects out of their bounded rationality and minimize the use of heuristics, and to go for optimal solutions rather than satisfactory ones, to reduce the reference to cognitive biases, to ultimately, or if possibly, attenuate them. This is where actually I've mentioned it wrong, not ultimately, but yeah. So now let's consider the example of confirmation bias. So for those who don't know what confirmation bias is, it is the tendency to view new information as confirmation of pre-existing thoughts and attitudes. So confirmation bias is very common nowadays, even on internet, especially social media. So we all use social media. I mean, uh, we all use WhatsApp, everything. So our life is incomplete, as I mentioned, without social media and internet. So we are prone to reading online news stories that reinforce our opinions while ignoring those that contradict them. Various social media platforms, such as Facebook, we all use Facebook to promote our confirmation bias by feeding us stories that we are not likely to agree with. And further, there's a possibility of us getting polarized. So confirmation bias can be particularly damaging in certain situations, such as the legal system. A detective may, for example, identify a suspect early in an inquiry and then look for corroborating evidence while downplaying fabricating evidence or falsifying evidence, which is a very troublesome case. So although confirmation bias has obvious consequences, one can still work towards overcoming it by being open-minded and willing to look at the situations from a different perspective than one is used to. And this looking at the different looking at different perspectives can be catered by using Anekantavada and Syadvada. So now I would like to give an example from all our favorite. Our favorite. If you follow crime novels or crime thrillers, Sherlock Holmes, I'm sure, would be on the top of your list. So let us consider an example from Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, where Sherlock Holmes tries to coach Mr. Watson as he accompanies Holmes to a crime scene. So even if you've watched Robert Downey Jr.'s movies, I'm pretty sure you can relate to what I'm talking about. So let's assume Mr. Watson isn't happy with Holmes's approach. So taking him as a subject, let us also assume that he constructs the following narrative of his own immediately after a conversation with Holmes. So this is the narrative. But when he got a case to deal with, I was astonished as well as impressed. I accompanied Holmes to the crime scene, an abandoned house in Brixton Road. You don't seem to give much thought to the matter in hand, I said at last, interrupting Holmes' musical disquisition when we were on our way. No data yet, he answered. You have all the evidence. It biases the judgment. Inspector Gregson and Lestrade were already on the scene. The victim was identified as Enoch Dever, and documents found on his person reveal that he has a secretary, Joseph Strangerson. So on the wall, written in red rage, German for revenge, which Holmes dismissed as a ploy to fool the police. I give it a thought. I felt Nojdaba was murdered by his secretary. Holmes is acting plain even when things seem to be clear about the murder. Anyone who knows about the Barnes mystery is a murder case, which is considered to be one of the prime cases in the Victorian era of 1979, can clearly sense that it's the secretary. So he makes an absolute statement. Can clearly sense that it's the secretary. All we need to do is delve deeper for proofs to establish this factually. So, points quoted from Mr. He's making absolute statements. Even before going to the crime scene, he asks Holmes that he's not giving a deep thought, and when he says that it biases the judgment, he again refers to a previous case that happened, and without having any concrete proofs, he's suspecting or probably accusing the secretary of the murder. So Watson is using heuristics to draw conclusions about murder, which is clearly bounded in terms of rationality. Two, he's having a confirmation bias as he for a previous murder, exploring other possibilities, even after Holmes says that it biases the judgment. So these are the points to be noted from the narrative. So now let me explain how Syad-narrative be constructed. So one of the prerequisites to be followed before constructing a Syad-narrative is to explain relative pluralism or Anekantavada to the subject through the story of the elephant and six blind men, as I already stated. Further, the absolute judgments made by the subject during the narrative therapy have to be noted and presented in addition of Syat, which is perhaps, possibly, or relatively. For example, in Mr. Watson's case, he made an absolute statement in his narrative saying that it is the secretary who killed the victim. So this statement can be reconstructed with Syat by adding possibly. So it is possible that the secretary has killed the victim, an Ostaba. So when we add terms such as possibly, relatively, perhaps to the absolute statements made by the subject and present the Syad narrative of it, it leaves some room for exploration of other possibilities. For example, and the subject will have some scope to reflect on their statements, and even in future they can explore the other possibilities. So now, without I'll just sum up everything that we have explored through this paper. Let me present my conclusion. So one, cognitive biases impact the decision making and judging processes of humans and are a product of bounded rationality. So it is the bounded rationality that we have to deal with to attenuate the reference to cognitive biases. And Anekantavada and Syadvada proposed as philosophical tools to make the subject realize the multifaceted nature of reality, to break the shell of bounded rationality, and then implementing the narrative therapy method. By implementing the narrative therapy method, a Syad narrative was constructed with which inclusion of Syad, relatively, possibly, perhaps, to enhance. By doing this, we can enhance the room for exploration of other possibilities or judgments, through which finally cognitive biases can be possibly minimized and, if possible, attenuated or mitigated. So I so thank you for me and my presentation patiently.